They found the ledger in late autumn, buried behind a collapsing wall of plaster and ash. The paper was fragile, its edges brittle as dried moth wings, but the ink, dark, deliberate, and cruelly neat, had survived the century. Inside the leather cover was a list of names, small, neat drawings in the margins, children, shackled, numbered, and a phrase scrawled in an older hand on the final page. "For my sons on the Nativity, 1854. The judge who ordered the demolition of the Baron's estate refused to speak of it afterward. The laborers, men hardened by years on the railroad, swore they would never again take work in a house that smelled like that, of scorched oil, old cedar, and something sour, like grief sealed too long. The ledger was catalogued, then sealed in a county archive and forgotten for nearly 70 years. When it surfaced again, wrapped in waxed paper, entire sections of it had gone missing. But one inscription remained intact enough to haunt the eyes that read it. Names of 2 sisters, purchased in Louisiana, delivered north before Christmas, 1854. Local records identified them only as Caroline and Clea. No surnames, no ages. The price beside each name, $47. The purchaser, Baron Gerald H. Duvall, lord of a sprawling Mississippi River estate, owning over 100 human lives by that winter, and, as rumor held, coveting power that could not be bought in cotton or coin. This is their story, but it is also the story of what came after, the chill that settled upon Duvall Hall, the deaths that followed, and the fire that took the house one Christmas Eve only a decade later, when the Baron's lineage met what locals still whisper was its due. What began as a gift that winter became something darker, a reckoning that outlasted the Civil War itself. Before we continue with the story of Baron Gerald Duvall and the twin sisters he tried to own, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The year was 1854. America on the cusp of rending itself apart. The nation was young, but already divided. A body fevered by industry in the north and by fields of blood and sugar in the south. In the river cities, Natchez, Vicksburg, New Orleans, wealth paraded proudly. Velvet waistcoats and parasols in the muddy streets, sprawling verandas with marble columns imported by boat. Every fortune built upon the suffering of others, every mansion humming with secrets. Natchez, Mississippi, called itself the jewel of the river, but by the mid-19th century, its jewel gleamed red. Beneath the magnolia blossoms and the laughter from the steamboats, human cargo passed quietly through auction blocks. The clatter of silver changed hands, while men in white linen appraised lives like horses. Baron Gerald Duvall's estate lay just west of the city, a Gothic sprawl of brick and live oak set upon a hill with its face turned to the Mississippi. Locals called it the Baron's Reach, and children dared each other to sneak through the iron gates after sundown. The gates themselves were forged in New Orleans and carried north on barge, black as sin. By day, the house glittered with wealth. Duvall's tobacco fields stretched 3 miles, and the main house carried 20 rooms, imported chandeliers, a library bound entirely in calfskin, wine bottles sealed in crimson wax. But what made Duvall feared rather than admired was not his wealth, nor his title, but the aura of calculation that hung around him. Old letters describe him as tall, near spectral, with an expression of patience that makes one's skin crawl. Reports claim his eyes missed nothing and forgave less. Born in Charleston to a merchant family, Duvall had studied chemistry in England and returned to America a self-styled aristocrat who insisted upon being addressed as Baron, though no European lineage was ever confirmed. He was known for hosting elaborate dinner parties where the wine never seemed to empty and the laughter, somehow, never reached the heart. It was said that he collected not just books and antiques, but people, musicians, servants, lost souls. And in the winter of 1854, he added to his collection 2 young girls. Natchez that December carried both joy and decay. Along the riverfront, vendors sold roasted chestnuts beside newspaper boys shouting headlines that were all about distant politics. Kansas-Nebraska Act passes. Fugitive slave law riots continue. America spoke of compromise, while the ground beneath it trembled with tension. Church bells carried through the fog each morning. The wealthy prepared for Christmas, their parlors lit by gas lamps, their mantels hung with imported holly. But outside those houses, the enslaved stood silently and rose before dawn, bare feet on frozen earth, whispering the words of songs that would never reach freedom. On one gray Sunday, near the docks, a small flatboat moored before dawn. Witnesses later recalled the sound of chains and the rasp of wooden crates being hauled ashore. Among them were the twins, 2 near-identical girls, one with a faint birthmark under her eye, the other missing a small portion of one ear. Their eyes, the bills of sale remarked, were light brown, almost golden when struck by firelight. The man who brought them north was not Duvall himself, but his overseer, Hector Vale, a brute of a man with a scar curling along his jawline like a second smile. Accounts say the girls never spoke during the 8 days' journey upriver, though Clea once hummed under her breath a melody the captain swore he'd heard before, during a yellow fever funeral in New Orleans. The delivery was signed on December 17, 1854. Payment received in full, recorded the auctioneer. The girls were classified as domestic servants, though witnesses on the estate would later note that no work was ever assigned to them. They were simply kept. And yet, from the start, something in that arrangement breathed unease. Workers claimed the Baron had forbidden them to utter the girls' names aloud after nightfall. Servants were instructed to leave food outside the twins' quarters without entering. And though the Duvall sons, one aged 12, the other 14, were the supposed recipients of their father's gift, they never seemed to play with the girls, nor even speak to them. Instead, the twins roamed the property silently, appearing whenever music played from the grand piano room, hands clasped together as if they shared a thought too heavy for speech. When asked, they would simply tilt their heads in unison, as though listening for something distant and inaudible. Through the winter, the fog at Duvall Hall thickened. Guests visiting for Christmas claimed that candles guttered without wind and that the Baron's dogs refused to cross the west hallway where the twins were lodged. One guest, a traveling reverend, wrote in his journal that he awoke one night to find both girls standing outside his chamber door, just watching. When he spoke, they turned away without sound. By spring, the river flooded, cutting the estate off from Natchez for weeks. No one entered or left, and the rumor mill began to turn, that the Baron had fallen under some private obsession, that his sons had sickened, that the twins were touched by the devil himself. But if you stood, even now, among the ruin of that estate, you would see how much of the story is written in architecture. The way the house curves downward toward the river, the broken windows like hollow eyes, and the original stones blackened not just by fire, but by something older than smoke. The sense lingers still. Locals say that when the river fog rises thick, you can hear laughter on the wind. 2 voices, almost one. In those years, the world itself seemed caught between ages. Modern science cracking open nature's secrets. Religion flaring in panic against it. Across the South, seances were held in candlelit parlors. Mediums claimed to commune with the dead soldiers of Europe's wars. The educated class flirted with the occult, half in jest, half in yearning for proof of something beyond moral decay. Baron Duvall, scholarly and prideful, found himself precisely in that intersection of intellect and superstition. His journals, what few survived, are a study in obsession. He wrote of binding the will of the inferior to perfect the superior, of twin essence as reflection of divine duality, body and vessel. His correspondence with the Prussian chemist hints at ritual magnetism, a fringe pursuit that claimed human spirits could be aligned like poles through electrical resonance. Was he experimenting on those girls? Was he merely studying them, or had he seen in them something he could not name? What is known is that following their arrival, the Baron dismissed his most trusted physician, Dr. Ambrose Clay, complaining that Clay was too squeamish for new methods. Within months, Clay would flee Natchez entirely, writing to a colleague that he would sooner hang than hear that music from beneath the hearth again. The winter of 1855 deepened the shadow. Natchez merchants gossiped that Duvall's youngest son, Auguste, had taken ill, his speech faltering, his skin ashen as candle wax. Nothing official was printed in the newspapers, but the postmaster's logs confirm a surge of private correspondence from Duvall Hall during those weeks. Bribes were rumored, payments to silence the city's physicians and clergy. When spring thawed the roads at last, the twins were seen once more, but only one of them walking in the fields with the Baron's surviving son, Lucien. Which sister it was never certain. In church records dated April 1855, a visiting priest from New Orleans logged a single cryptic note after a weekly service. One of the Baron's gifts sings without breath. I fear God's hand has withdrawn from that house. By then, what had begun as commerce, the exchange of bodies for money, had curdled into something unholy. And so, when the fire came 10 years later, it was not treated as tragedy, but as a kind of judgment. Yet the ledger that outlasted the blaze, ink still vivid a century later, tells us this. Evil rarely burns away clean. It leaves ash that seeps into history, blackening the pages yet unread. That ledger marks the beginning of the story, but the footsteps that led to its discovery stretch across generations. What happened to the twins? Why did every witness either vanish or recant? And what exactly lay beneath the foundations of Duvall Hall, the chamber locals still refuse to excavate? For that, we must step closer into the darkness, into the age when aristocracy and atrocity were indistinguishable, and when belief itself could become a weapon sharper than any blade. No story of Duvall Hall can begin without its architect, the man who carved a kingdom from the mud of the Mississippi and filled it with his own reflections. Gerald Hiram Duvall was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1817, under the full glare of a June sun that drove slaves and livestock alike to shelter. His father, a merchant in sugar and ship parts, died before the boy reached 10, leaving behind both a modest fortune and a rumor of debts unpaid. His mother, a woman of French descent and iron temper, moved the family to New Orleans, where young Gerald would learn French courtesy, Creole charm, and the art of disguise that made Southern aristocracy thrive. Gentility drawn over brutality like lace over rust. When he came of age, Duvall took a ship to Europe, ostensibly to study chemistry. But his letters home, what few survive, speak far less of experiments than of long winter nights in London taverns and correspondence with men of exceptional theory. In a Parisian student club, he met occult circles who spoke of vital magnetism, of souls intertwined by energy rather than divinity. To this friendship, and perhaps to an addiction to impossible knowledge, he owed his later ruin. He returned to Mississippi a changed man. Neighbors remembered his posture first, straight, predatory, precise. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it was never the right moment. Children feared him not because of what he did, but because of what they imagined he might. He called himself Baron, claiming his mother's lineage once held land in Gascony, though no record existed beyond his own word. Still, the title fit him the way a curse fits its host, comfortably and forever. By the time of the twins' arrival, the Baron was 37 and widowed twice. The first wife, Anne Louise, died during childbirth. The second, Martha Clay, sister to his dismissed doctor, was found drowned in the fountain at the rear gardens. Her body, the coroner noted, bore no sign of struggle. Gerald declared the death a suicide, a result of delicate nerves, though some spoke quietly of screams that echoed across the lawns the night prior. The Baron never remarried. He ruled his estate like a kingdom of silence. Even dinner conversation was rationed. Servants spoke only when asked. Those who disobeyed were dismissed or, in 2 cases, vanished without reference. "My household," he once wrote in a surviving letter, "exists to conduct order, as a symphony obeying only one conductor." Late in life, a former overseer named Lafayette Hill described him differently. He wasn't cruel in the way most planters were. He didn't whip often, didn't beat. But he looked at you like he was writing you down somewhere, like you weren't real until he put your name on paper. Now, imagine that gaze turned upon 2 girls for whom the world already allowed no real existence. The Duvall sons were, at first glance, ordinary boys of privilege. Lucien, the elder at 14, possessed his father's sharp features and a dangerous intelligence. Too proud to be gentle, but too curious to be cruel. His diaries, discovered in fragmentary form, show a boy desperate to earn his father's respect, scribbling Latin verbs and curious sketches of birds' skeletal wings. He wanted to be seen by a man who seemed incapable of affection. One evening, years later, a tutor recalled hearing the boy muttering Latin by candlelight while staring into the pond behind the house. When asked why he studied so late, Lucien replied, "Father says souls are like light through glass. But if light can be bent, then so can souls." Auguste, the younger son, was different. A delicate child who drew maps of clouds on the backs of receipts, and who, despite his sicknesses, filled the house with a strange music. The few letters surviving from his nursemaid describe him as sweet-tempered and loyal to any creature smaller than himself. He would sneak bread to the dogs chained by the barn, or lift beetles from the dirt to return them to safety under leaves. To him, the world was not hierarchy, but kinship. It made him both strange to his father and tender to his mother, until her death. Afterward, his laughter faded, replaced by fevers and fainting fits that the estate physician called melancholy of the blood. When the twin girls arrived, witnesses recalled that Augusta's eyes lit up like lanterns. He greeted them shyly in the courtyard, offering one of his mother's old ribbons. One girl, Caroline or perhaps Clea, accepted it and tied it about her wrist. The other only stared. "Do you think they are angels?" Auguste whispered it to his brother that night, as their father's study echoed with the low hum of some unseen contraption. Lucien replied, impatient, "They're gifts, not angels. We are meant to learn something from them." "What?" Lucien looked out toward the window where, in the moonlight, the twins stood in the yard below, motionless as statues. "How to become as quiet," he said. Then there was Hector Vale, the overseer, the heavy-handed enforcer whose loyalty to Duvall was as unwholesome as the power he wielded. Born to Irish immigrants outside Mobile, Vale entered Duvall's employ after a manslaughter accusation forced him to flee Alabama. The Baron admired violent men the way a falconer might admire his birds, useful so long as they obeyed the leash. Vale did. Not out of respect, but profit. Vale carried a scar on his face like a map of sin, one field hand later wrote. When he spat, it sounded like he was chewing gravel, and when he smiled, you could see your ending in it. He oversaw the transport of the twins north from Louisiana. Rumors claim he fed them nothing for 2 days, so they would arrive obedient. When questioned about cruelty, he reportedly told a river captain, "The Baron's property doesn't need fattening, it needs refining." Yet later testimonies suggest he was unnerved by the girls. A ferryman remembered Vale pacing the deck at night, drinking heavily, muttering of eyes that watch from inside. On arrival at the estate, Vale resigned within a year, leaving behind only his whip and a note addressed to no one. The small ones whisper when the lights go out. And finally, the twin girls themselves. There are few verifiable details about Caroline and Clea. Their ages were guessed between 9 and 11, though both were small for those years, likely stunted by hardship. The bills of sale record them as Creole, with unremarkable features. Yet every account that followed contradicts that cold notation. They made impressions no words could contain. They were lovely, said an elderly woman interviewed in 1920 who claimed to be the daughter of one of Duvall's kitchen workers. But not in a way a child ought to be. They were identical beyond comfort. If one blinked, the other seemed to feel it. If you saw them both together, you'd swear you were seeing one reflected in a mirror that could breathe. Some said they barely spoke, except to each other in whispers of French patois and an older, unfamiliar tongue. Others claimed they sang softly in twined harmony when the staff carried trays through the West Hall, voices rising like a single note divided into two. They never asked for anything, the same woman recalled. Only sometimes they looked at us like they pitied us for being only one. When pressed that spring to describe them precisely, Gerald Duvall wrote in his private journal, "Beautiful in proportion, uncanny in will. Their gestures synchronize even during sleep. If the soul has frequency, they resonate at the same pitch. A physicist might call them instruments awaiting calibration." It was in that cold language that he saw them, not as children, but as objects intersecting with his private speculation of soul and science. By midwinter, the house had already begun to feel their presence. Servants carried gossip through the quarters, mirrors fogging without heat, clocks stalling at the same minute each night, and that strange sound of humming from the nursery wing, like a lullaby through water. August, the younger son, was the only one who dared play with them. His nurse recounted overhearing him laugh one morning in the garden while one girl plaited his hair and the other drew shapes in the dirt. He waved when she approached. "Miss Clara, they say they've been here before," he said. "Before where, child?" "Before," he repeated softly. "Before Father found them again." That evening, the Baron confronted the twins in the parlor, kneeling before them as though testing their obedience. The only witness, a footman polishing the floor nearby, described it many years later in a letter. He asked which one was which. They didn't answer. He raised his hand to strike one. Both closed their eyes. The moment his hand dropped, the chandelier above cracked right down the middle and went dark. He stood there in the silence, looking at them, his face all wonder and fear mixed. Then he smiled. The first honest smile I ever saw on him. By week's end, he had dismissed half the household staff and ordered the nursery wing sealed for his private studies. Of those who moved through that house, none left untouched. We know some names only from burial ledgers or missing person postings. The nurse, Clara, was dismissed in 1855 for insubordination. Her later testimony, given to a journalist after emancipation, described the house before her departure. The air was so still you could hear your own heartbeat. Sometimes I'd be schooling Auguste with his letters, and he'd stop and look over my shoulder. I'd ask what he saw. He'd say, "Her." But when I turned, there was just light, like from the river through the window. Doctors accused her of hysteria. Papers called her mad. Yet every description she gave, the hum, the darkness in the West Hall, the laughter that wasn't laughter, would later align with other witnesses who never knew her. Through the winter, Lucien grew more withdrawn, his temper sharpening. He began to shadow his father into the locked study. There, according to later inventories, Duvall kept an assortment of European instruments, a fractal pendulum, Leyden jars, glass spheres filled with magnetized salts. Locals called it the Devil's Workshop. One December night, a servant carrying logs to the basement overheard voices. 3, not 2, chanting in rhythm. He swore on his deathbed that when he looked through the keyhole, he saw the twins standing opposite each other, and the Baron between them, eyes closed, hands on their temples. It looked like prayer, the man recalled, but it sounded wrong, like prayers said backwards. Within weeks, Auguste fell ill again. No doctor could identify the sickness. His skin chilled, his pulse slowed. When awake, he begged for candlelight, whispering that the darkness breathed like lungs. One night, his father locked the room and forbade anyone entry. In the morning, Auguste was silent, his smile fixed as though mid-dream. Lucien recorded that night in his journal. They said he sleeps, but I watched his chest. It moves with the rhythm of theirs, across the hall. What makes every name in this ledger tragedy rather than myth is that we still have pieces of their lives in ink and echo. The Baron's handwriting evolves from scholarship to mania across those pages. Lucien's diaries dissolve from curiosity into horror. And though Caroline and Clea left no words of their own, every story told about them reads as if they authored it from somewhere unseen, pulling memory itself by invisible threads. They were victims, perhaps. Miracles, some said, monsters, others whispered. But in that house they were neither free nor forgotten. They were mirrors, reflecting what lay hidden in every soul around them. And as one old archivist put it, decades later while turning the brittle pages of Duvall's surviving notes, if hell has music, it sounds like two voices humming the same note, forever, almost, but not quite together. It began with the clocks. According to the surviving house logs taken by Duvall's steward, every timepiece in the mansion, grandfather clock, drawing room pendulum, even the guests' pocket watches, halted at precisely 3:03 a.m. on the 6th night after Christmas, 1854. The servants who checked the devices found the mechanisms unmoved, the brass interiors cool to the touch, as if time itself had simply refused to move for that single hour. In the hush after the discovery, someone whispered that 3:03 was the hour the Baron's first wife had died years before, the minute the midwife recorded the child's first cry. That coincidence became the opening act of a private terror that would stretch far beyond the Duvall household. The Baron, alarmed yet intrigued, invited the local clockmaker from Natchez, a meticulous German named Albrecht Neumann, to inspect the machinery. Neumann later testified under oath, after the house's burning, that he found nothing wrong with the gears or coils. Something interfered, he said, not with iron or spring, but with will. Duvall rewarded him with gold, then forbade him ever to speak of it again. The servants whispered anyway. January brought a damp fog from the river that did not lift for days. It rolled through the fields, swallowing fences whole, and slid up the great hill toward Duvall Hall like a living thing. The twins roamed that fog, often barefoot, unaffected by the cold. One worker tending livestock at dawn claimed he heard them humming a tune that wasn't quite human. He watched from a distance as both girls folded their arms together and tilted their heads toward the riverbank, as though listening to a whisper embedded deep in the mist. When he asked what they were listening to, one replied, "The other ones." He returned, shaken, crossing himself in secret. By planting time, 3 workers had abandoned the estate, muttering of unnatural girls and the white folks' tricks that bring misfortune. None gave formal notice. They simply vanished, leaving the cotton half-planted, the tools streaked with rust from dew that refused to dry. The first death of that new year came quietly. A maid named Ruth, barely 16, drowned in the ornamental well at the rear courtyard. There was no cry, no struggle heard, only the discovery of her body at dawn, eyes wide open, her arms clasped across her chest as though in parody of a child's prayer. The coroner listed it suicide under fevered mind, but the overseer found her shoes neatly placed beside the well and a small mark burned into one wrist, 2 overlapping circles, like the figure 8 turned on its side. The symbol reappeared weeks later, pricked faintly into the candle wax pooling on the Baron's study shelves. No one admitted drawing it. No one dared erase it. News of the death reached Natchez quickly. The city's small but fierce Baptist community seized upon it as evidence of divine punishment. The Reverend Simon Dell, a broad-shouldered presiding elder known for thunderous sermons, delivered a fire-lit homily declaring Duvall's mansion Sodom on the riverbank. "Fine curtains cannot hide rot," he thundered. "The devil does not enter through poverty. He comes through pride, and pride builds fine estates." He was not wrong. 2 days later, the Baron attended service at that very chapel, unexpected, unannounced, cutting through Dell's sermon like a blade. He stood in the aisle, hat in hand, and said quietly, "Sir, if there is rot in my house, it is only because you breathe it into the air." The Reverend's hand trembled on the pulpit. "You bring evil here, Baron," he said. "I do not bring it," Duvall answered. "I study it." He left in silence, but his tithe for the week, an entire pouch of Spanish silver, remained on the front pew when the congregation dispersed. Once he returned home, the Baron doubled the household's already punishing discipline. Candles were banned after dusk except in his laboratory. Workers were forbidden to enter the Western Hall. Meals for the twins were lowered by rope through a narrow trap door, a ritual the new housekeeper found both cruel and inexplicable. When she inquired whether this isolation hurt the girls, Duvall said, "It teaches them symmetry." By February, strange illnesses spread among those who remained. Servants complained of sleep paralysis, waking to find themselves unable to move, the air thick as molasses, hearing faint humming at the foot of their beds. One groundskeeper awoke to footprints on the ceiling above his cot, 2 small bare impressions that trailed off into nothing. A journal belonging to Lucien confirms the rest. Father says their breath alters the air. He says they are mirrors of each other in body, but not soul. He wants to even them, to make the difference vanish. When I ask why, he says a balanced vessel can hold perfection. I do not know what vessel he means. Sometimes at night they whisper through the door. They do not call for me, but for Auguste. I think they do not know he is gone. Or worse, I think they do. The handwriting breaks mid-sentence. In the nearby town, gossip grew like mildew. The general storekeeper swore that whenever shipments for the Duvall estate came through, chemicals, narrow vials of glass, and even once the parts of a newly invented voltaic battery, the horses would balk at the sight of the crates. "They smell wrong," the stablemen insisted, refusing further deliveries unless paid double. It was about this time that lightning struck the old oak at the estate's entrance gate and split it in 2. The twins were seen sitting beneath it the night before. Local rumor sweetened the story quickly, that their eyes flashed with the strike, that they smiled when the thunder rolled. Whatever the truth, the tree died standing, black as iron, for a decade. March arrived with oppressive warmth. Mosquitoes swarmed early, and fever simmered through the valley. Yet Duvall's mansion seemed immune. Not a single case of illness struck his household, except for one. Lucien's complexion turned pallid, his sleep troubled. Witnesses heard him shout in Latin at shadows, repeating a phrase from some schoolbook verse. "Quem imitario portet? Quem imitario portet? Whom must we imitate?" When questioned by the family physician, the Baron intercepted. "My son is undergoing refinement," Duvall said. "He sleeps in daylight to preserve the rhythm I have instilled." The doctor resigned that same night, leaving behind his stethoscope and half his dignity. The following week, The town postmaster received a sealed envelope addressed simply to the Office of Law, Natchez Courthouse. Inside lay a single scrap of paper torn from ledger stock, upon which was written in spidery hand, "Help us. We are not what he wants us to be. The air hurts when he sings." No signature, but faint traces of blood along the edge suggested a hand too small for an adult. The sheriff sent a deputy to investigate, but upon approaching the estate, the man's horse threw him violently and fled into the trees. The deputy limped back to town, muttering that he'd heard a voice like a church organ under the ground. No further investigation was made. By mid-year, the Baron hosted no guests. The windows were shuttered, the gardens overgrown. The only movement observed came from occasional flashes of pale blue light within the locked west wing, glimpsed through the cracks at night by field hands passing the property line. One witness compared the glow to moonlight caught in water. Still, some remembered laughter, childlike, rhythmic, echoing down the hill through fog too thick for sight. It came always in pairs of voices, never apart. Natchez society, pragmatic even in gossip, slowly excised Duvall from its invitations. He had become a phantom among his peers, spoken of only in whispers between sips of bourbon. Still, his wealth bought silence, and silence gave the devil his due. Inside those walls, however, silence had voices. Records preserved from the housekeeper's ledger, smuggled by her after her midnight flight in 1856, paint a portrait of dread made domestic. She wrote of the night she carried linens to the upstairs rooms and heard the twins speaking behind a closed door. The words, she said, came in perfect synchrony, every syllable together, as if one mouth inside two throats. She froze when she realized that beneath their voices ran a third tone, a low hum like the vibration inside a church organ pipe. From the corridor she saw light spilling under the door, not white, but colorless, absence glowing. When she dared peek through the keyhole, she beheld the two girls standing on either side of the Baron's smallest son's bed, heads bowed, hands clasped, the boy's chest neither rising nor falling. Yet, when the Baron entered moments later, the boy breathed again, gasping as though air had returned by command. "Perfect," whispered Duvall. "Almost perfect." The housekeeper fled before dawn. The Baron paid her final wage in silver and told her never to return. The estate's few remaining workers kept distance from the main hall, laboring in sullen fear as spring melted toward the feverish summer of 1856. The songs that once rose from the quarters dwindled to murmurs. When anyone spoke of the twins, they referred to them not as people, but as presences. The echoes, the pair. Those two. Others called them omens. An elderly preacher who passed the estate by boat one night claimed he saw two small figures lit by their own light at the window, watching the river flow backward. He prayed on it for near an hour, but the vision would not leave him. "I knew then," he'd later write, "that whatever dwelt in that house was older than the river and twice as determined." And yet, amid the terror, fascination bloomed. The Baron began transcribing his nightly experiments into Latin, inviting only his elder son to observe. Lucian's notes recorded fearful wonder. "Father says souls communicate through the pattern, not words, and that these two are the original pattern, mirror and echo. He promises me salvation through symmetry." How long faith can survive under such reasoning is unclear, but the boy's writing falters precisely when the fog of that summer thickened into something near palpable dread. Locals began reporting odd sounds from beneath the hill, holes opening along the riverbank, yawning and closing like mouths. Livestock veered from the water, and at dusk the frogs fell silent, as if even nature had drawn its breath and chosen not to speak. But perhaps the most telling sign came one evening that September, when a preacher traveling from Baton Rouge found his path blocked by the Baron himself. standing at the halfway mark of the levee road. The old minister would later recall the man's expression: calm, intense, the manner of someone who had solved an equation that frightened even its maker. "I hear you speak against me in Natchez," Duvall said. The preacher lifted his Bible. "I speak against sin wherever it hides." The Baron smiled faintly. "Then you misunderstand. I do not flee sin, I refine it." He gestured east, toward the black outline of the mansion against the clouded moon. "Tell your flock that hell is not below us," he said. "Hell is repetition without end, and soon you will see what repetition can make of flesh." The preacher rode on without reply, but when he looked back, the mist had swallowed Duvall whole. By autumn, neighbors swore they could hear music from the house, melodies that started beautifully and decayed into chaos. Those who passed after sundown kept their eyes down, muttering prayers into their coats. Inside, Lucian wrote one last clear line before his journal dissolved into incoherence. "They are trying to make me one of them." After that, the record falls silent, as though even ink had lost its courage. The horror had germinated quietly. No monsters at first, no blood on the wallpaper, only rhythm and repetition, and things slightly misaligned. Yet for those who endured those early months, the question began to whisper through every night breeze: which of us moves of our own accord, and which of us simply echoes what has already been done? For the people of Natchez, the answer came much too late. By the winter of 1857, the Duvall estate no longer felt like part of Mississippi. Locals said frost lingered longest on its gates, even when the river valley had already thawed into spring. Visitors sometimes spoke of hearing faint knocking beneath their boots, the throb of an underground heartbeat. No one stayed past sunset. No one dared accept Gerald Duvall's invitations anymore. But the invitations kept coming. He sent letters sealed with black wax, lined with gold ink, inviting doctors, philosophers, and ministers from across the state to witness what he called the first harmonization of living souls. Most ignored him. A few did not. In March of that year, Dr. Ambrose Clay returned from exile. Rumor said he came seeking forgiveness. For what, no one was yet sure. A man of medicine and skeptical temperament, Clay had once admired Duvall's mind, if not his morals. He arrived unannounced, his carriage wheels sinking into the damp earth of the overgrown drive. The Baron welcomed him with eerie warmth. "You came back before the final proof," Duvall said, leading him into the shuttered hall. "I knew you would." "I came," Clay replied, sweating under his collar, "because there are whispers. You've frightened half the county." Duvall smiled thinly. "Half of them fear God. The other half fear losing their small worlds, and I have offended both." "How many lives have you offended in the process?" "Only one. The rest are in progress." Clay would later recount, between bouts of fevered guilt, that the air in that hallway felt charged, humming faintly like a great lantern burning behind a wall. It was as if sound itself had form, he told one deacon hours before vanishing from Natchez forever. "I swore I heard breathing from inside the stones." The reunion between the two men reopened conversations the Baron had once kept secret. For weeks, Duvall and Clay debated in the dim library, soul against science, faith against feverish curiosity. Lucien, now nearly 17, served as attendant, pouring wine and transcribing fragments of his father's proclamations. The twins, by then, had disappeared from public sight entirely. Clay attempted reason. "These are children, Gerald, not experiment. Whatever brilliance you chase, you're burning it through flesh." "You speak as if flesh was anything more than a conduit," Duvall countered. "They aren't children. They are pattern made manifest. Two beings sharing one echo. Through them, harmony can be pulled from chaos. And isn't that the work of all creation? Creation belongs to God. Then perhaps God left the laboratory door open. There was madness in his calm. Clay left the conversation trembling, convinced he had stood not before genius, but revelation gone septic. Soon, Natchez began to tremble with gossip once more. Night barges upon the river froze their engines when passing Duvall's Hill, fearing the sudden bursts of light under the soil, pulses like lightning with no storm to explain them. The sheriff, pressed by local ministers, opened a formal inquiry, but found the gate locked, the driveway patrolled by 2 former militiamen now in the Baron's employ. "We guard against thieves," one said. "What thieves?" the sheriff asked. "Those who steal truth." Unable to prove wrongdoing, he retreated. Yet, behind the walls, the truth worsened. Lucien began speaking in dreams. The house servants, those few who still remained, heard him pacing nights, whispering the same phrase, "She comes when it rains." The one time a maid asked who she was, the boy grinned without humor and said, "Both of them." The same week, the housekeeper's dog died after drinking from the cistern. The water tinged faintly silver, slick on the surface like quicksilver. In the record of the local pharmacist, there remains a line dated June 2nd. Purchase by G.H. Duvall. Mercuric salts, 2 pounds, no stated medical purpose. Why would a man buy mercury in the heat of summer? Answer, because mercury flows like light in metal form, and light, Duvall insisted, was the bridge between life and soul. The local press finally took interest. The Natchez Courier published a small column on June 15, 1857. Rumors persist regarding certain unnatural experiments conducted by Mr. Gerald Duvall, self-styled Baron, at his plantation near the River Bend. Multiple servants have abandoned post claiming supernatural disturbances. Powers of the county are urged to investigate, lest this estate bring further calamity upon our community. The article caused a brief sensation, forcing Duvall from solitude into defiant visibility. He sent a letter to the editor the following day, printed in full the week after. "Sir, curiosity is not calamity. The soul does not burn for being examined, nor does faith weaken from proximity to knowledge. Let those who whisper of demons come and see reason attended by witnesses, lest history recall them cowards while calling me merely patient." Readers scoffed. Others trembled. Still, curiosity outweighs conscience, especially in men of intellect. Within a fortnight, 3 guests, Reverend Simon Dell, Dr. Clay, and a journalist named Henry Malloy, accepted Duvall's invitation to witness the demonstration. They arrived on June 20th, faculty robes and notebooks betraying more skepticism than courage. The journalist's notes, rescued later from mildew in the courthouse, described Duvall's demeanor as polite, almost kindly, with an undertone of triumph. He led the men through the locked West Hall, now stripped to bare brick, the windows covered with iron mesh. The air felt 10 degrees colder beyond that threshold. Inside, Malloy wrote, stood 2 glass tubes linked by copper wiring to the Baron's modified battery, and at either end of those tubes, 2 small forms seated upright in wooden chairs. They were motionless, the journalist recorded. Not asleep, still. I swear I saw breath fog the glass, faint but rhythmic. The Baron called them his daughters of reflection. The sound of that phrase made my spine twist. Clay demanded to end the experiment instantly. Dell shouted scripture. The walls answered back with an unholy echo, their own voices bending into tone. Duvall lifted one hand. "Gentlemen," he said, "observe symmetry." He rotated a silver dial. Electricity hissed through the wires, faint crackle filling the silence. The twins stirred, slow as clock hands, opening eyes at the same moment. Light, soft, mercury pale, glowed around their pupils. Each raised an arm in perfect unison, fingers twitching as if plucking invisible cords in the air. Then the humming began, the same low pitch the servants had cursed for years. The copper between the tubes vibrated so hard that sparks shot upward, leaving the smell of burning dust. Dell collapsed to his knees, gasping prayers. Clay pushed forward, shouting, "You'll kill them!" Duvall laughed ecstatic. "Look, the pattern holds." And then came something words had never held before. The girls' voices overlapped in a single wordless cry, one pitched high, one low, fusing mid-air into a sound that wasn't human, wasn't instrument, but both. The windows quivered. Malloy's pen cracked in his fist. When silence returned, the two children still sat, though one now bled faintly from the nose. "She cannot sustain perfect resonance," Duvall murmured with mathematical detachment. "Neither can you," Clay said. Dell fled first, stumbling into the rain, his Bible soaked open to Revelation. The journalist followed. Only Clay remained long enough to pull the copper wires from the batteries, shouting, "You've summoned nothing but your own damnation." Duvall struck him hard enough to break his spectacles. The house servant said the lightning that night was not like other storms. It flashed from beneath the ground up, painting the clouds from below. After that evening, everything shifted. Reverend Dell died within a fortnight, apoplexy, though some swore his face had turned gray the second he left the gates. Dr. Clay vanished en route south the following autumn, his body never found. And Henry Malloy, the journalist, returned to Natchez raving, his notebooks destroyed by his own hand. His editor recorded only one coherent statement before he was committed. The sound continues even where the rear forgets it. The Duvall estate sealed tighter than ever. Workers discharged, produce ceased shipment. Rumors thickened that Lucienne was now pale as wax, that the twins no longer cast shadows, that the Baron had commissioned a mortuary sculptor to carve two alabaster figures for reasons unrevealed. One winter traveler, seeking shelter, claimed that from the road he saw silhouettes dancing in the upper windows, 3 shapes, moving as one. Whether by music or madness, he could not tell. The mayor of Natchez authorized a second inquiry in early 1858. This time, the sheriff led a small contingent of armed deputies to the gate in daylight. They found it ajar. The fields lay empty. The house silent. Inside, nothing stirred except the whisper of turning pages from somewhere unseen. The men explored room by room, kitchen cold, dining hall abandoned, walls lined with chemical stains. In the study, they found notebooks stacked high as a man's waist, each numbered meticulously from 1 to 73, filled with diagrams of human heads divided into mirrored halves, annotated Symmetry Salvation. Then, in the West Hall, they heard the faint hum, like the inside of a seashell. The deputies drew pistols. The door at the end of the corridor quivered as if breathing. They forced it open, and whatever they saw drove them back in terror. One discharged his weapon through the ceiling. All 3 refused to describe their discovery. The sheriff only managed. They weren't alive, but they weren't dead either. He ordered the house sealed and declared that Baron missing. By the next dawn, the entire mansion had gone up in flames. The fire burned differently. Quiet, colorless, gone before midnight. Rain ought to have saved it, yet nothing could. The following morning, only the shell of the foundation remained, and from beneath the wet ash, the workers uncovered something metallic, the fused halves of a silver locket shaped as the same symbol carved on Ruth's wrist years before, an infinite curve. And inside that melted circle, a lock of 2 identical hairs curled together. No trace of Baron Gerald Duvall, no burial for the twins. The Natchez paper eulogized the estate with cautious relief. Let this tragedy remind citizens that arrogance against the Almighty breeds ruin. The so-called Baron, once held in esteem by few and suspicion by many, has met destruction by his own hand, or by that of Providence itself. Yet destruction never ends neatly. For years afterward, reports lingered. Travelers heard humming from beneath the hill. Passers-by saw flickers of lamplight under the ruins. Children, daring each other near the property line, spoke of a chill that moved through their chests like a separate heartbeat. The sheriff resigned within months, drinking himself into oblivion. The courthouse sealed all documents pertaining to Duvall under sensitive religious matters, an absurd phrase that guaranteed fascination. And late that year, an anonymous pamphlet circulated among New Orleans' scientific societies titled On Resonant Dualism and the Mirrored Soul, Fragments from the Experiments of G.H. Duvall. Scholars scorned it as fraud. Some privately admitted the mathematics were sound. In the decades that followed, the story hardened into folklore. The Duvall twins became Mississippi's mirror ghosts, symbols of guilt unresolved. Each town embellished the tragedy into myth. Some said Duvall sought to transmute life into light. Others that the girls had been angels punished into flesh. Each telling left the same residue: fear of reflection, fear of repetition, fear that what we call the self might only be an echo already rehearsed elsewhere. And yet, among the unclassified papers at the Natchez Historical Society, there remains one article, published unsigned in 1894 and long forgotten until recent discovery. It reads, "There are nights when the river current reverses for but a moment, when moonlight bleeds upward from the water rather than down. On those nights, the locals refuse to look into any mirror. They say the Baron's work continues, seeking still its perfect symmetry." What do you think? Guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Decades later, curiosity would drag the story back to light. In 1892, a team of land surveyors was sent to map the riverbank near the ruins of Duvall Hall for a new levee project. They expected clay and limestone, nothing more. By evening, they had unearthed bone. At first it looked like animal remains, tangled in roots. Then one noticed the shape of a wrist, fine as porcelain. When they brushed the dirt aside, they found two skeletons laid in mirror formation, heads touching, feet opposed, as if even death had preserved their symmetry. Between them lay a rusted copper wire spiraling downward into the earth. The men brought their find to Natchez. The coroner identified the bones as belonging to children aged about 11, both female, both with faint deformities in the ribs, where bones had fused unnaturally, perhaps the result of sustained shock. The official report concluded little beyond burial deliberate, prior disturbance of grave impossible without extensive tools. But one of the surveyors confided to his wife what the papers omitted. When we lifted the skulls, the earth beneath still hummed. Time moves on, but ghosts cling to curious hands. In the autumn of 1893, historian and amateur theologian Walter Broderick, fascinated by tales of the Duvall estate, petitioned the authorities to access its sealed archives. A veteran of the Union Army, he felt both disgust and secret wonder toward the antebellum South, its grandeur, its brutality, its appetite for redemption. He expected to find proof of cruelty masked as science. Instead, he found only obsession disguised as faith. The surviving journals, smeared, water-stained, some written backwards as if for secrecy, contained Duvall's final notes before the fire. They revealed no confession, no repentance, only ecstatic description. One fragment read, "Duality is not sin, it is Genesis. If the Almighty formed man from dust, then I have merely drawn dust together again by pattern. The balance is near complete. Once souls align, distance and grief will end. One heartbeat to serve both. One vessel to cage eternity." Broderick stopped reading twice, heart racing, yet pressed on. A later line chilled him deeper. "The child withers. The vessel fails because pain divides frequency. Pain introduces noise. Pain is necessary." There were sketches, 2 circles overlapping, the same infinity symbol repeating again and again, evolving until it wrapped around the outline of a human face. And at the page's bottom, a name. Not Caroline, not Clea, but Lucienne. It seemed incredible that the final iteration of his experiment might involve his own surviving son. Yet the evidence built. Another page torn along the edge, bearing the heading Phase of Reversal, and scribbles of an organ-like apparatus driven by electromagnet. In its corner, one phrase inscribed in French, Le fils et l'echo, the sun and the echo. When Broderick published his findings in a small academic review that winter, many dismissed it as Gothic exaggeration. But among post-bellum intellectuals uneasy with both religion and reason, the story found fertile ground. Theologians debated whether Duvall's notion of harmonized souls was blasphemy or innovation. Occultists hailed him as a lost pioneer of spiritual magnetism. Literary newspapers, of course, ignored nuance and printed instead, "Devil's science behind Natchez fire. Baron's own son victim of satanic fusion." The same week that article printed, the Broderick household began suffering odd disturbances. His lamp chimneys cracked in symmetrical halves. Mirrors bloomed frost overnight. He heard a faint hum when setting pen to paper. His wife found him one midnight seated at his desk muttering, "They are unfinished." Within the month, he vanished from town. His boots were later discovered near the Duvall ruins, sunk heel-deep in mud, pointing toward the river. We will never know precisely what occurred inside those final hours of 1857, but a handful of indirect witnesses, servants spared by dismissal, provided enough shards to reconstruct the moment before the fire consumed proof. One woman, Delilah Moore, interviewed in 1880, recalled seeing the Baron and his son carry large casks toward the cellar days before the blaze. He said he was preserving essence for stability, she told the interviewer. Asked what essence, she shuddered. Not wine. The smell was sharp, like lightning laid in a bottle. That night, smoke was seen rising not from the roof, but from beneath the ground. The gardener, fleeing through rain, looked back and swore the entire house glowed from within, the bricks radiating pale, colorless fire. And in all that roar, he said, you could hear singing, 2 voices, then 3, then 1 again. It is easy, sitting in our electrified century, to dismiss such accounts as hysteria. Yet the world of mid-19th century Natchez believed keenly that the border between science and sorcery was thinner than muslin. Mesmerism, animal magnetism, spirit photography, all had their prophets. Duvall's tragedy bridged every fear at once, the faithless power of reason, the sinful curiosity of man, and the haunting truth slavery had always whispered, that the bodies of others were instruments for the ambitions of the powerful. Even as his house crumbled, Duvall had written one final appeal, not to God nor posterity, but to those who would continue the pattern. His note, preserved among the burnt papers, reads, "If symmetry is heaven's language, imperfection is hell's dialect, but both can be tuned." Somewhere between those words and the ashes lay the explicit horror that even after witnessing ruin, he still believed himself divine. In 1910, a new family built a modest farmhouse atop the old foundations, unaware or unbelieving of the legend. Within weeks, their daughter began sleepwalking to the well each night, stopping precisely where the twin skeletons had been uncovered years before. When the father tried to restrain her, she whispered in a voice he swore was doubled, "He's almost finished singing." They left by spring. The house soon collapsed from disuse. Local folk cautioned travelers from taking stones from the site, yet collectors always do. One piece of brick, darkened but magnetic to touch, entered the holdings of a Louisiana antiquarian named Evelyn Case. She kept it on her desk beneath a glass dome. In 1921, Case's assistant told reporters that the glass sometimes fogged from within, as though the stone breathed. When Case died suddenly of stroke that winter, the brick vanished from her estate sale. Artifacts multiply superstition. So when, in 1964, a demolition crew clearing the older levee uncovered the remnants of a subterranean chamber, it was natural that county officials sought expert opinion before proceeding. The small room, little larger than a stable stall, contained rusted copper wire coiled through a rotted organ bellows, long since collapsed. At its center lay a female child skeleton with a tangle of metal fused around the skull. Beside it, pressed into the hardened mud, was a fragment of parchment sealed in a jar, remarkably preserved. The ink, once deciphered under ultraviolet light, revealed not a confession but scripture, a single sentence adapted from Genesis. "And God made man in his image. I shall make image in mine." No formal museum would accept the item. It rests now locked behind civic storage, sealed as private cultural controversy. That might have ended it, tidy as fear allows. Yet the story's last voice belongs to a man who died without name in a Natchez hospital in 1972. His confession filled 6 pages of near illegible pencil scrawl, discovered only because a nurse thought the handwriting lovely. He claimed to be a descendant of Lucien Duvall. The statement begins lucid, almost apologetic. You think he burned, but that night he did not perish. He changed. Fire was not destruction, but transfer. Our blood hums in storms. I have heard the frequency since childhood. By the 3rd page, clarity dissolves. They are the beginning and end. 2 threads, 1 weave. You cannot pray away pattern. You can only complete it. When the current flows right, the mirror opens. He will step through. On the final page is a familiar drawing. 2 interlocked circles, and inside them, 2 lowercase letters opposite each other, C and L, Caroline and Clea. If those words are madness, they're at least consistent madness, echoes reaching across generations. And somewhere between faith and physics, echo becomes theory. Electrical engineers who examined fragments of Duvall's notes in the 1980s remarked that his concepts of resonant alignment anticipate by decades the discoveries of harmonic frequencies used in early radio telegraphy. Others found within his symbols a chilling resemblance to later psychological studies of twin consciousness. Science, like superstition, leaves traces of truth inside its terrors. If symmetry was Duvall's idol, then repetition was his ritual. Every hum from beneath that hill, every mirror death, every recurrence of the infinity mark through history. Each one whittles toward the same revelation, that obsession itself doesn't die, it reproduces. So imagine this. The night the fire devoured Duvall Hall, the Mississippi reflecting flame like an unbroken mirror. Inside that conflagration, the Baron crawling toward his collapsed laboratory, robe smoldering, hair afire. The copper wires hiss like serpents. The twins stand amid smoke, their small hands clasped, eyes wide but calm. Lucien kneels nearby, choking on soot, whispering, "Father, stop." But Duvall does not stop. He tears the dial from its mount, presses his bleeding palm against the machine, screaming, "Symmetry! Seal it!" The battery explodes. Blue light floods the room. The girls' voices rise in perfect unison, one above human hearing, the other below. Then, stillness. When the lower floors ignite, Lucien drags himself toward the stair, clutching something close, a small silver locket, shaped like the figure 8. In it, 2 curls of identical hair, the twins' last gift, or their warning. He slips it into his pocket as ceiling and soul collapse together. Out on the lawn, the gardener sees him run into the storm, hair illuminated by that pale, unnatural glow. The twins' song following him through the rain, one note splitting in 2, then fusing again. He never reaches the gate, but the humming, the very pitch of it, continues in the soil long after the fire cools. That was no accident of heat or chemistry. It was transfer, pattern escaping to its next host. We can now understand why the ledger survived when paper should have burned, why ink darkened instead of fading, because repetition had found somewhere new to live. Memory, retelling, the endless human appetite for unfinished stories. Every whisper of the Baron's research, every child who hums absent-mindedly by the river, keeps a trace of that design alive. Listen closely on windless nights near Natchez, and you may feel it, the ground vibrating as if remembering. Beneath your shoes, symmetrical pulses answering in time to your own heartbeat. For what else is haunting, if not repetition, we cannot silence. When modern believers speak of evil, they often imagine chaos, disorder, rage without pattern. Yet all truly terrible things, from plague to war to the cold machinery of slavery itself, are built upon order, repetition, symmetry, system. Duvall sought beauty in perfect balance and found only horror, because horror, too, can be precise. He bound 2 lives to prove 1 soul, forgetting that unity achieved through pain is not harmony, but tyranny. And like all tyrants, he mistook control for creation. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. When the smoke cleared, Natchez regarded Duvall Hall as closure. It wasn't. The fire turned him into what society most worships and most fears, a symbol. In 1858, the county sheriff described the disaster as the righteous hand of Providence. But privately, even the pious worried, because something about the ruin defied plain moral arithmetic. A man bent on mastery over others had perished, yes, but at the cost of voices the world would no longer name. The twins whose only record remained in ledgers nobody dared display. Across the South, as the nation limped toward civil war, newspapers retold the Duvall legend with relish. Some used it as parable, greedy master punished by his own hubris. Yet among planters and aristocrats, the story carried uneasier notes. A few recognized themselves in his portrait, educated, restless, blind to the cruelty murmuring underneath their refinements. What terrified them wasn't the ghost. What terrified them was the mirror. By 1863, travelers spoke of freedmen gathering near the ruins to pray, lighting candles and whispering hymns for the 2 who were never granted names. A Union sergeant noted in his diary that the scene unsettled him more than battle. They prayed for the lost souls with gentle power, and I felt we all stood trial under that music. After the war, missionaries turned the remains of the Duvall property into an orphan refuge. They built simple cottages and a small chapel from unburned brick. For a while, calm returned. But parish records reveal that 3 nuns assigned to the site asked for reassignment within a year. One wrote to her superior, "The children hum strange songs. None of them knows the words." The institution closed quietly in 1872, its congregation dispersing upriver. The old chimney stacks became landmarks for stories told to restless youngsters. Don't go where the fog hangs low. It hums back at you. Decades passed, and the tale evolved with America itself. Each generation refitted the myth to its fears. During the age of electricity, journalists rebranded Duvall as a cautionary scientist, a Southern Frankenstein whose experiments predicted modern hubris. In the spiritualist boom of the 1890s, mediums claimed they could channel the twins of the river, their seances ending in violent tremors of tables. For every skeptic debunking them, there were believers who arrived in droves, drawn by grief's universal promise that death obeys reason if only one whispers the right formula. In the 1930s, anthropologists collecting African American folklore recorded local elders who called the legend the White Baron's Curse. They remembered the twins not as victims but as avengers, spirits sent to unravel bondage from the inside. He tried to bind them, one old man told the researchers, but you can't bind what's already both halves of the same whole. They balanced him right out of the world. By then, Duvall had melted from monster into moral allegory, proof that slavery corrupted even genius into madness. It made textbooks for a decade, a macabre footnote in the study of Southern religion and early pseudoscience. But quietly, scraps of evidence kept surfacing. An etched piece of copper discovered in the river mud bearing the infinity mark. An audiograph test in the 1930s that captured low subsonic hums near the ruins. Identical left and right channel. The locals shrugged. Old ground sings sometimes, they said. And perhaps that should have been the final rest. But evil doesn't rest. It hibernates in curiosity. In 1964, university archaeologists began their ill-fated dig that uncovered the copper apparatus and the skeleton described earlier. When the report leaked, townspeople flocked again to the site. Teenagers camped near the ruins, challenging the night to repeat itself. Two swore they heard twin voices whispering from the river, counting backward. Police called it hysteria. Yet the curiosity had done its work. One of the students kept a small piece of that copper wiring as souvenir. Within a year, he was dead. Auto accident on a clear road. His passenger, a girlfriend later interviewed by faculty, survived long enough to say, "The radio shrieked before the crash, singing two notes that bent together." Coincidence, perhaps. But pattern loves coincidence. It feeds on repetition. By the late 20th century, modern Natchez built its industry on heritage tourism, grand manners, Spanish moss, sweet tea. Yet Duvall Hall never joined the brochures. The city fathers called the scar bad business. Archaeologists petitioned for state preservation. Their funding evaporated. Churches quietly opposed excavation, claiming lingering blasphemy made the ground unfit for sanctified hands. The ruins remain fenced but unmonitored, a patch of vines and rust where teenagers still test bravery. Urban legend insists your phone dies near the well, your recording devices hum on playback. Tour guides drive quickly past, lowering their voice when pointing to the distant hill, each retelling another small repetition. In recent years, historians revisiting the Duvall records have drawn sobering parallels between that house of symmetry and the century that followed. Pseudoscientific race theories, experiments on the powerless, the cold apparatus of progress justified by order. Gerald Duvall was many things: tyrant, visionary, blasphemer. But mostly he was a preview. The belief that knowledge without empathy can cleanse the world is still humanity's oldest superstition. That, more than any ghostlight, is what still haunts Mississippi's Misty Bend. Because if you walk the levee at dusk, the echoes you hear are not just his. They are ours, the hush before every modern cruelty, whispering that perfection will justify the cost. And as long as people keep building their own orderly nightmares, the Duvall legend will remain less warning, more mirror. So ends what the locals once called the Song of the Baron, a melody built of arrogance, pain, and the yearning to command what should only be understood. The ruins may have crumbled, the ledgers browned into dust, but the rhythm of Duvall's folly still hides in plain sight. Every invention that mistakes precision for mercy, every doctrine that harms in the name of balance. The twins became myth to spare us the harder truth, that evil rarely roars, it hums, soft, familiar, almost beautiful. Next time you glimpse your reflection and notice it linger a fraction too long, remember that pattern. Remember the hum beneath silence and the hands that once mirrored each other in firelight, seeking to be whole. So what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled or buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments below. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story.